January 31st, 1943. The basement of the Universum department store, Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus sat at a makeshift desk, hands trembling as he signed the surrender document that would seal the fate of 91,000 German soldiers. Outside, Soviet troops waited to accept the capitulation of the Sixth Army, once the Wehrmacht's most powerful formation. The man who had commanded over 250,000 men just 5 months earlier now controlled nothing but the ruins around him. His army had been promised relief. His Führer had promised victory. His Luftwaffe had promised supplies. Every promise had been a lie. Through the shattered walls, he could hear German soldiers singing Silent Night in frozen bunkers, their voices weak from starvation. This was impossible. The German army did not surrender armies. It did not lose entire field armies. It did not abandon 250,000 men to death and captivity in a single campaign. Yet here sat the first German field marshal ever to surrender. Pen in hand, signing away not just an army, but the myth of German invincibility that had terrified Europe for 3 years. The mathematics of catastrophe were already calculated. 147,200 German soldiers dead, 91,000 captured, of whom only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. 500 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 1,500 artillery pieces lost, 6,000 vehicles burned or frozen into uselessness. But these numbers, staggering as they were, told only part of the story. The real destruction was psychological, strategic, and irreversible. Stalingrad had shattered the Wehrmacht's offensive capability, broken the mystique of German military supremacy, and shifted the strategic initiative to the Soviet Union permanently. The transformation from conquerors to besieged had begun 6 months earlier in a decision that combined ambition, delusion, and catastrophic underestimation of the enemy. April 5, 1942. The Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. Hitler spread maps of southern Russia across the table, explaining to his assembled generals the campaign that would win the war. Operation Blue would seize the Caucasus oil fields, cutting Soviet fuel supplies while providing Germany with petroleum reserves sufficient to continue the war indefinitely. The city of Stalingrad, an industrial center on the Volga River, was mentioned almost as an afterthought. The city held symbolic importance bearing Stalin's name, but strategic value seemed limited. Capture it, destroy its industrial capacity, cut the Volga River transport route, then move south to the real objectives in the oil-rich Caucasus. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, studied the plan with growing unease. His diary entry from that day, discovered in German archives decades later, revealed professional skepticism that he dared not voice aloud. The Führer is obsessed with Stalingrad because of its name. Operationally, the city is a diversion from our main objective. Strategically, fighting for a city offers the Soviets exactly the kind of battle they need. Close-quarters combat that negates our mobility advantage. But no one will tell him this. We are driving toward a battle we should avoid to capture an objective we don't need. The fundamental miscalculation began with German intelligence assessments of Soviet capability. By summer 1942, Germany had destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks, killed or captured nearly 4 million Soviet soldiers, and occupied territory containing 40% of Soviet population and industrial capacity. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated Soviet military power was broken beyond recovery. The assumption that guided Operation Blue was simple. The Red Army was finished as an offensive force and could only conduct limited defensive operations. This assessment, shared by virtually every senior German commander, would prove catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, appointed to command the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad in September 1942, understood something German planners did not. Urban combat fundamentally altered the military calculus that favored German combined arms tactics. His orders to his subordinates, recorded in the 62nd Army War Diary, laid out a defensive philosophy that would destroy the Wehrmacht's assault. The enemy must be fought at such close quarters that his air force and artillery cannot be used without hitting his own troops. Every house must be a fortress. Every room must be defended. Every basement must be a strong point. We will turn this city into a furnace that consumes German strength faster than they can feed it. August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe launched the most concentrated air attack in history to that date against Stalingrad. Over 600 bombers dropped approximately 1,000 tons of incendiaries and high explosives on the city in a single afternoon. The firestorm killed an estimated 40,000 civilians and destroyed most wooden structures. German commanders watched the smoke column rise 15,000 feet and assumed the city was finished as a defensive position. General Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Luftflotte 4, reported to Berlin, "Stalingrad no longer exists as a city. Resistance should collapse within days." The opposite occurred. The rubble created by German bombing provided better defensive positions than intact buildings would have offered. Collapsed structures created maze-like terrain that channeled German attacks into killing zones. The destruction forced both armies into close-quarters combat, where German advantages in artillery, air power, and armored mobility became irrelevant. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German infantryman with the 267th Regiment, recorded his shock in letters home. "We thought the bombing would end resistance. Instead, it created a fortress. Every pile of rubble hides Russian soldiers. Every crater becomes a machine gun nest. We advance building by building, room by room, and the Russians make us pay for every meter in blood." The battle for the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure on the city's southern edge, illustrated the new reality. September 18th through 22nd, 1942. Approximately 40 Soviet soldiers, a mixture of Marines and infantry under Junior Lieutenant Andrei Koziainov, held the elevator against elements of the German 94th Infantry Division, supported by tanks and artillery. German forces attacked for 4 days. The Soviets ran out of ammunition and resorted to hand-to-hand combat with entrenching tools, knives, and bare hands. When Germans finally took the elevator, they found 18 Soviet survivors among the 40 original defenders. German casualties exceeded 200 dead and wounded. Obergefreiter Albert Schwartz, who participated in the assault, wrote in his diary, "The Russians fought like demons. We used flamethrowers, grenades, automatic weapons, and tank guns. They fought back with anything they could grab. I saw a Russian soldier with both arms broken still trying to bite German soldiers. These are not human beings. These are fanatics who prefer death to surrender. We won the elevator after 4 days. The victory cost us more than any battle in France or Poland." The pattern repeated across Stalingrad. The Red October factory, the Barakadi gun factory, the tractor factory. Each became a separate battlefield where German forces achieved Pyrrhic victories at costs that bled the Sixth Army white. German doctrine emphasized maneuver and breakthrough. Soviet tactics forced positional warfare and attrition. The transformation from mobile operations to static grinding matched neither German training nor temperament, but the rubble of Stalingrad left no alternative. What German commanders failed to recognize was that every day spent fighting in Stalingrad was a day Soviet forces used to prepare the counterstroke. While General Friedrich Paulus concentrated his entire attention on capturing the final slivers of Stalingrad's western bank, Soviet Stavka, the High Command, assembled massive forces north and south of the city, hidden behind featureless steppe terrain that offered no obvious targets for German reconnaissance. The Soviet plan, designated Operation Uranus, embodied strategic thinking on a scale the Wehrmacht no longer comprehended. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky designed a double envelopment targeting not 6th Army directly, but the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, protecting 6th Army's flanks. These Romanian formations, equipped with obsolete weapons and spread impossibly thin across hundreds of kilometers, represented the Wehrmacht's Achilles heel. Soviet planners knew that breakthrough against Romanian positions would open paths to encircle the German forces, grinding themselves to exhaustion in Stalingrad's ruins. November 19, 1942, 07:20 hours. Soviet artillery opened fire along the Romanian 3rd Army's positions northwest of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Over 3,500 guns and mortars fired approximately 1 million shells into Romanian defensive zones. Romanian soldiers, who had been promised German artillery support that never materialized, broke under bombardment intensity they had never experienced. Romanian Lieutenant Colonel Dumitru Gheorghe, whose battalion disintegrated in the first 2 hours, recorded the apocalypse in his final report. The shells fell like rain. The earth itself seemed to explode. Communications were severed in the first 10 minutes. By the second hour, organized resistance had ceased. Soldiers who survived the bombardment fled or surrendered when Soviet tanks appeared. We had been assured German forces would reinforce any breakthrough. No Germans came. We were abandoned. The Soviet 1st Guards Army and 5th Tank Army punched through Romanian lines and advanced 40 kilometers in the first day. The Southern Pincer, launched November 20th against Romanian 4th Army positions south of Stalingrad, achieved similar results. By November 23rd, the 2 Soviet pincers met at Kalak, 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. 6th Army and elements of 4th Panzer Army, approximately 250,000 German and Romanian soldiers, were encircled. The shock rippled through Wehrmacht command structure. General Paulus radioed Army Group Don headquarters, requesting permission to break out westward before Soviet forces consolidated the encirclement. His message, preserved in German military archives, conveyed desperate urgency. 6th Army is encircled. Fuel supplies sufficient for 30 kilometers. Ammunition stocks adequate for 3 days of defensive combat. Request immediate authorization to break out to the southwest. Delays will make breakout impossible. Hitler's response, transmitted through Wehrmacht High Command, destroyed any hope of salvation through retreat. 6th Army will hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe will supply the pocket by air. Relief forces are being assembled. Stand fast. The decision, made by a man 2,000 kilometers from the battlefield, who had never commanded troops in combat, condemned 6th Army to destruction. But Hitler's order rested on assurances from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that proved as delusional as the Führer's strategic vision. Göring promised the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled forces, sufficient to sustain 6th Army until relief arrived. His air transport commander, Generaloberst Hans Jaschonek, immediately recognized the promise was impossible. The Luftwaffe possessed insufficient transport aircraft. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns controlled the air approaches to Stalingrad. Winter weather would ground aircraft for days at a time. Jaschonek's staff calculated that even under ideal conditions, maximum delivery capacity would reach perhaps 300 tons daily. Actual requirements exceeded 700 tons. The airlift began November 25th and failed catastrophically from the first day. Soviet fighters, primarily Yak-1s and Lay-5s, flown by increasingly experienced pilots, intercepted German transports with devastating effect. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket, creating gauntlets of fire that transport pilots had to navigate twice on every mission. Winter weather that turned runways to frozen mud grounded entire transport wings for days. The Luftwaffe lost 488 transport aircraft destroyed and 1,000 aircrew killed trying to supply 6th Army. Average daily deliveries totaled approximately 100 tons, 1/7 of minimum requirements. Captain Wilhelm Adam, aide to General Paulus, recorded the degradation in his daily journal. December 15th. Soldiers receive half rations. December 20th. Rations cut to 1/3. December 25th. Men receive 100 grams of bread, thin soup, and occasionally horse meat. January 5th. Soldiers are dying from starvation faster than from combat. January 15th. Men too weak to walk are still expected to defend positions. January 25th. Cannibalism reported. In some units, this is not warfare. This is murder. German soldiers, accustomed to overwhelming material superiority, discovered what Soviet civilians had endured during the 1941 to 1942 winter. Starvation creates suffering that exceeds the horror of combat. 6th Army slaughtered every horse, every dog, every rat. Soldiers burned furniture, books, and ammunition crates for heat in temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius. Medical supplies exhausted, surgeons amputated frostbitten limbs without anesthetic. The wounded died not from their injuries but from cold, starvation, and infections that antibiotics stored in German warehouses 500 kilometers away could have cured. The promised relief never materialized. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, assembled 4th Panzer Army for Operation Winter Storm, a thrust intended to break through to 6th Army and establish a supply corridor. The offensive, launched December 12th, achieved initial success, advancing to within 50 kilometers of the pocket before being stopped by Soviet reserves that outnumbered German forces by factors that made success impossible. Manstein urged Paulus to break out toward the relief force while the opportunity existed. Paulus, bound by Hitler's orders to hold Stalingrad, refused. The relief force, facing encirclement itself, withdrew. 6th Army was abandoned. Inside the pocket, military discipline began dissolving. Soldiers who had conquered Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and much of Russia in rapid campaigns could not comprehend the catastrophe engulfing them. Lieutenant Wilhelm Bredow, commanding a company of the 71st Infantry Division, described the psychological collapse in a letter smuggled out by a wounded officer evacuated by air. The men no longer believe anything headquarters tells them. They know the relief is not coming. They know the supplies are insufficient. They know we are dying for nothing. Some still fight because they are soldiers and know no alternative. Others simply wait for the end. A few have shot themselves rather than face capture or slow death from starvation. We were promised victory. We were promised Germany would never abandon us. Every promise was a lie. The final Soviet offensive to eliminate the pocket began January 10, 1943. Operation Ring employed 7 Soviet armies totaling over 280,000 troops, supported by 300 tanks against German forces, reduced to approximately 195,000 effectives, many too weak from hunger to fight effectively. The outcome was inevitable. Soviet forces compressed the pocket systematically, using artillery and infantry assaults to reduce German defensive lines, kilometer by kilometer. German units fought with the desperation of men who knew survival was impossible. Death was certain, and only the manner and timing remained uncertain. The Soviet offensive unfolded with methodical precision that reflected how far the Red Army had evolved from the chaotic defensive battles of 1941. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front responsible for eliminating the pocket, employed tactics that combined overwhelming artillery preparation with infantry advances supported by armor operating in close coordination. The approach was not subtle, but it was effective. Soviet doctrine had learned that against desperate defenders in fortified positions, frontal pressure combined with relentless advance achieved results more reliably than complicated maneuver. January 22nd, the Gumrak airfield fell to Soviet forces, eliminating the last runway capable of receiving transport aircraft. German wounded, who had been promised evacuation, lay in frozen bunkers, watching their final hope of escape disappear. The Luftwaffe made heroic attempts to continue supply drops, but aircraft dropping supplies from altitude in winter weather achieved accuracy measured in kilometers, not meters. Supplies intended for German positions frequently landed in Soviet-controlled areas. The degradation of German combat effectiveness in the pocket's final weeks shocked even veteran Soviet commanders. Lieutenant General Mikhail Shumilov, commanding the 64th Army attacking from the south, reported encountering German soldiers too weak to retreat when their positions were overrun. Some attempted to surrender but lacked strength to raise their arms. Others sat in frozen bunkers, weapons beside them, waiting for death with passive resignation that suggested they had passed beyond caring whether death came from Soviet bullets, starvation, or cold. German medical facilities, overwhelmed by casualties and stripped of supplies, became scenes of horror that haunted survivors. Surgeon Dr. Ottmar Kohler, captured when his aid station was overrun January 28th, described conditions in testimony given during his captivity. "We had no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no bandages beyond what we tore from clothing. We performed amputations with carpenter's saws. We treated gut wounds, knowing the patients would die from infection within days. We laid the dying in corridors because the operating rooms were full. When soldiers died, we left the bodies where they fell because we lacked strength to move them, and they would freeze into the floor within hours. This was not medicine. This was triage for mass death." German soldiers trapped in the pocket understood with growing clarity that they had been betrayed by their leadership. The promises of relief had been lies. The assurances of air supply had been fantasies. The orders to hold at all costs had condemned them to pointless death. Hitler's proclamation that German soldiers would never surrender entire armies only meant they would die rather than live. The bitter realization that their sacrifice served no military purpose beyond Hitler's megalomania poisoned the final weeks with resentment that overshadowed even physical suffering. The Sixth Army, fragmented into isolated groups as Soviet advances, severed internal communications. The northern pocket centered on the tractor factory fell January 26th. The central pocket around Red Square held until January 31st. The southern pocket surrendered February 2nd. Of the 91,000 Germans who entered Soviet captivity, approximately 6,000 survived to return to Germany in the 1950s. Typhus, dysentery, starvation, and brutal treatment in Soviet POW camps killed the rest. The human cost of Stalingrad exceeded comprehension. Axis forces lost approximately 400,000, dead, wounded, or captured across the entire campaign, including the encirclement battle and relief attempts. Soviet casualties totaled over 1.1 million, including 480,000 dead. But the Soviets could replace those losses. Germany could not. More critically, Germany lost not just soldiers, but veterans, experienced NCOs, trained officers, and specialists who had survived 3 years of warfare and represented irreplaceable human capital. The material losses compounded the human catastrophe. Sixth Army's destruction consumed 500 tanks, 500 artillery pieces, 6,000 trucks, 23,000 tons of ammunition, and equipment sufficient to outfit 20 divisions. These losses occurred simultaneously with the Wehrmacht's commitment to Tunisia, where another 250,000 Axis soldiers would be destroyed by May 1943. Germany faced a two-front catastrophe from which recovery was impossible, but the strategic consequences transcended arithmetic. Stalingrad proved the Wehrmacht could be defeated decisively, that German soldiers could be forced to surrender entire armies, that Hitler's promises were worthless, and that the Red Army possessed operational sophistication matching German prowess. The psychological impact on both German and Soviet forces was profound and permanent. German soldiers who had believed themselves invincible faced the reality that they could lose, that their commanders could fail them, that their nation might be defeated. Soviet soldiers who had endured 3 years of catastrophic defeats discovered they could win, that German forces could be encircled and destroyed, that victory was possible. The propaganda war surrounding Stalingrad began before the fighting ended. Soviet information bureaus broadcast news of the encirclement worldwide, proclaiming that German military supremacy was finished. Radio Moscow, broadcasting in multiple languages, transmitted detailed accounts of German suffering in the pocket, simultaneously demoralizing German audiences and inspiring Allied populations with evidence that Nazi Germany could be defeated. The broadcasts combined truth with exaggeration, but the core message required no embellishment. An entire German army had been trapped and was being systematically destroyed. German propaganda struggled to counter the narrative disaster. Goebbels' ministry initially censored all news of the encirclement, permitting only vague reports of heavy fighting in the Stalingrad area. When the scale of the catastrophe became impossible to conceal, German media shifted to portraying the Sixth Army as heroic defenders, buying time for Germany to mobilize. This narrative required ignoring that the Sixth Army's destruction resulted from Hitler's refusal to permit withdrawal when escape was still possible. The global reaction revealed how completely Stalingrad transformed perceptions of the war. Neutral nations that had hedged their diplomatic positions based on assumptions of eventual German victory began reassessing their calculations. Turkey, courted by both Germany and the Allies, shifted toward neutrality that favored the Allied cause. Spain, which had sent the Blue Division to fight alongside Wehrmacht forces, began quietly reducing its pro-Axis commitments. Sweden increased iron ore prices charged to Germany while expanding trade with Britain. Switzerland, whose banks had financed German expansion, began accepting that Allied victory was probable and adjusting policies accordingly. In occupied Europe, resistance movements drew inspiration from Stalingrad's demonstration that German forces could be defeated. French resistance networks expanded recruitment. Yugoslav partisans intensified operations. Polish underground forces prepared for eventual German collapse. Norwegian resistance sabotaged German installations with growing boldness. The psychological transformation from hopeless resistance against inevitable German victory to determined struggle toward achievable liberation changed the character of occupation warfare. The shift in strategic initiative became immediately visible. Before Stalingrad, Germany launched offensives and the Soviets responded. After Stalingrad, the Soviets seized initiative that they never surrendered. Operation Little Saturn, launched in December 1942 while Sixth Army died in the pocket, destroyed Italian Eighth Army and threatened the entire southern wing of the German front. The Red Army offensive continued into spring 1943, recapturing territory, destroying German units and creating the strategic conditions for the Battle of Kursk, where German offensive capability would be permanently broken. Allied reactions revealed Stalingrad's global significance. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, February 11, 1943, captured the moment's meaning. The hinge of fate has turned. The Germans who besieged Stalingrad have themselves been besieged and destroyed. This is not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Russia has proven she can not merely resist but defeat German arms. The Nazis who thought to conquer the Soviet Union in 12 weeks have now lost an entire army in a single city. American President Franklin Roosevelt's message to Stalin, delivered February 5, 1943, acknowledged the strategic shift. The epic defense of Stalingrad and the subsequent encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army mark a turning point in the war against Nazi tyranny. The Red Army has demonstrated that the Wehrmacht is not invincible, that German operational art is not supreme, and that the Nazi regime can be defeated through courage, sacrifice, and superior strategy. German reactions ranged from shock to denial. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, initially suppressed news of the surrender, then attempted to transform catastrophe into mythology. His Sportpalast speech of February 18, 1943, tried to rally German morale through the concept of total war, asking a carefully selected audience whether they supported total mobilization to prevent German defeat. The speech's hysteria revealed the regime's terror that Stalingrad had broken German faith in victory. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning, positioning the Sixth Army as heroic martyrs rather than defeated soldiers, a narrative that fooled no one who understood military reality. German generals, meanwhile, began recognizing that the war was unwinnable. General Kurt Seitzler, who had replaced Halder as chief of the Army General Staff, attempted to convince Hitler that Germany must seek negotiated peace before total defeat became inevitable. Hitler rejected such discussions as defeatism, purging officers who suggested anything but total victory. The professional military leadership that had enabled German victories began fragmenting as competent officers were replaced by Nazi loyalists willing to echo Hitler's delusions. The military lessons from Stalingrad influenced warfare for decades. The battle demonstrated that urban terrain negated technological and tactical advantages, that logistics mattered more than courage, that encirclement remained the supreme operational maneuver, and that air supply could not sustain large forces under combat conditions. Soviet military doctrine incorporated these lessons, emphasizing deep operations, mobile warfare, and operational encirclements that would characterize Red Army offensives from 1943 to 1945. German survivors carried trauma that marked them for life. Lieutenant Joachim Wieder, one of the few who returned from Soviet captivity, published his memoir in 1962, describing Stalingrad's psychological destruction. "We entered Russia as conquerors, confident that we were the master race destined to rule inferior peoples. We left Stalingrad as broken men who understood that we were not superior, that our cause was not just, and that our nation had been led to catastrophe by criminals." The physical suffering, starvation, cold, wounds, was terrible. The psychological suffering, understanding that our sacrifices were meaningless, that our comrades died for nothing, that our leaders had betrayed us, was worse. Soviet veterans remembered different trauma. The victories cost 1.1 million casualties to destroy 400,000 Axis soldiers, reflected Soviet willingness to accept losses that Western nations would have considered intolerable. Senior Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, who defended the apartment building that bore his name for 58 days, reflected in a 1985 interview, "We held that building because we knew that every German soldier we killed in Stalingrad was one fewer German soldier who would kill Russians elsewhere. The cost was terrible. Almost everyone I fought with died, but we won. Russia survived. That mattered more than our individual lives." The strategic transformation Stalingrad created became fully visible in summer 1943 at Kursk, where Soviet forces not only defeated the last major German offensive, but launched counter-offensives that liberated Ukraine and drove toward the Dnieper River. The Red Army that had broken and fled in 1941, that had suffered catastrophic defeats in 1942, had evolved into a force capable of destroying Wehrmacht field armies through superior operational planning, adequate material resources, and leadership that had learned from disaster. The industrial dimension of Stalingrad often receives less attention than the combat, but Soviet industrial evacuation and reorganization enabled victory. Factories relocated beyond the Urals in 1941 reached full production by late 1942, producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that matched or exceeded German output. The Soviets built approximately 24,000 tanks in 1942 compared to 9,300 German tanks and assault guns. Soviet artillery production reached 33,000 pieces in 1942 versus 12,000 German guns. The material balance had shifted decisively, enabling operational concepts that required accepting equipment losses Germany could no longer afford. The transformation of the Red Army from the shambling wreck of 1941 to the sophisticated force of 1943 reflected Stalin's willingness to learn from failure, a quality Hitler never displayed. Soviet command structure was decentralized, giving field commanders like Chuikov and Zhukov authority to execute operations based on battlefield conditions rather than ideological imperative. German command remained rigidly centralized around Hitler, whose strategic decisions increasingly reflected fantasy rather than military reality. The contrast between Hitler and Stalin's responses to crisis illustrated broader differences in how the two dictatorships functioned. Stalin, confronted with catastrophic defeats in 1941, dismissed incompetent commanders, promoted capable officers regardless of political reliability, accepted professional military advice, and subordinated ideology to military necessity. Hitler, confronted with Stalingrad's disaster, blamed subordinates, dismissed competent commanders, rejected professional advice, and doubled down on ideological commitment to total victory. Stalin's pragmatism enabled Soviet recovery. Hitler's rigidity ensured German destruction. The geopolitical consequences of Stalingrad extended beyond the Eastern Front. The decisive Soviet victory convinced Western allies that the Soviet Union would survive and probably prevail, shifting Anglo-American calculations about post-war Europe. British and American planners, who had hedged against possible Soviet collapse in 1942, began preparing for a Europe where Soviet power would dominate the East. The decisions made at Tehran in November 1943 and Yalta in February 1945 reflected recognition that Soviet military power, proven at Stalingrad and confirmed at Kursk, would determine Eastern Europe's future. For Germany's allies, Stalingrad triggered reassessment of their commitments. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces had suffered catastrophic losses in the Stalingrad campaign, and their governments began seeking exit strategies from a war that now appeared unwinnable. Italy would leave the Axis in September 1943. Romania and Hungary would attempt to negotiate separate peace in 1944, though German occupation prevented their withdrawal until Soviet forces arrived. The Axis coalition that had seemed formidable in 1941 began fragmenting as the consequences of Stalingrad cascaded through Europe's strategic landscape. The mythology that developed around Stalingrad obscured some realities while illuminating others. Soviet propaganda transformed the battle into an epic of heroic resistance against fascist aggression, minimizing the catastrophic casualties and emphasizing ideological triumph. This narrative, while simplistic, contained essential truth. The Soviet Union had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any Western nation and emerged victorious through unprecedented sacrifice. German mythology, developed by Wehrmacht veterans in post-war memoirs, blamed Hitler's interference while portraying German soldiers as victims of superior Soviet numbers, a narrative that ignored German strategic failures and Soviet operational competence. The actual reality was more complex and more instructive. Stalingrad was neither simply German operational failure nor simply Soviet numerical superiority. It was a confluence of German strategic overreach, Hitler's refusal to permit tactical flexibility, Luftwaffe inability to execute promised logistics, Soviet operational sophistication in planning and executing the encirclement, Red Army tactical adaptation to urban combat, and Soviet willingness to accept casualties that achieved strategic objectives. All these factors mattered. None alone was sufficient. Together, they produced catastrophe for Germany and transformation for the Soviet Union. The battle's influence on military thought extended decades beyond 1945. Urban warfare became a distinct discipline in military education, with Stalingrad serving as the primary case study. Logistical planning incorporated Stalingrad's lessons about airlift limitations, supply requirements for encircled forces, and consequences of strategic overextension. Operational doctrine emphasized the decisive nature of encirclement and the difficulty of rescuing trapped forces once a pocket closed. For the soldiers who survived, Stalingrad remained the defining experience of their lives. German survivors returned to a nation that had lost the war and struggled to reconcile their sacrifice with ultimate defeat. Soviet survivors rebuilt a nation devastated by war and struggled to process trauma that official ideology could not acknowledge. Both groups carried wounds, physical, psychological, and moral, that never fully healed. The final surrender in the Univermag basement, where Paulus signed the capitulation document, created a moment of symbolic symmetry. The field marshal, who had commanded an army larger than most nations' total forces, surrendered to a Soviet lieutenant colonel. The ceremony was brief, bureaucratic, and anticlimactic. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations, just the mechanical processing of defeat. Paulus was led away to captivity. His staff was marched out to join the columns of German soldiers, trudging east toward POW camps most would never leave. The contrast between German confidence in June 1942 and German catastrophe in February 1943 illustrated how completely strategic miscalculation can destroy military forces. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union expecting victory in 12 weeks had lost the war in 30 months through cumulative failures of intelligence, strategy, logistics, and command. Stalingrad was not the sole cause of German defeat, but it was the moment when defeat became inevitable and visible. The city itself, destroyed so thoroughly that reconstruction required decades, became a monument to the battle. Renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, then reverting to Stalingrad for ceremonial purposes in 2013. The city carries memory of sacrifice that transcends political ideology. The Mamayev Kurgan Memorial, dedicated in 1967, dominates the city with its 85-meter statue, The Motherland Calls, a representation of the battle's meaning to Soviet, Russian identity. For historians analyzing how World War II's strategic balance shifted from Axis advantage to Allied victory, Stalingrad marks the pivot point. Before Stalingrad, Germany retained strategic initiative and ability to launch major offensives. After Stalingrad, Germany fought defensive warfare that could delay but not prevent defeat. The transformation occurred not through gradual attrition, but through catastrophic destruction of an entire field army in a single campaign. The lessons remain relevant wherever military forces confront the challenges Stalingrad illuminated. Logistics matter more than tactics. Urban terrain negates technological advantage. Air supply cannot sustain large forces under combat conditions. Encircled forces cannot be relieved when the encircling force is stronger than the relief force. Strategic objectives that exceed available means produce catastrophe. Ideological commitment cannot substitute for military reality. The field marshal who signed surrender documents in January 1943 had believed in June 1942 that Stalingrad would fall in weeks. The army that entered the city expecting easy victory died there across 5 months of combat that consumed German strength faster than Germany could replace it. The promises of relief, of air supply, of ultimate victory all proved worthless against the reality of Soviet operational skill, material resources, and willingness to accept costs that achieved strategic objectives. By February 1943, the myth of German military invincibility lay buried in Stalingrad's ruins, alongside 147,200 German dead. The Wehrmacht would win tactical victories in subsequent years, would inflict horrific casualties on advancing Soviet forces, would demonstrate professional competence that remained formidable. But it would never again launch strategic offensives, never again dictate operational tempo, never again control the war's direction. The Red Army seized initiative at Stalingrad and maintained it through Berlin. The young German soldier who had written letters home from Stalingrad describing confidence in German victory fell silent in January 1943, his frozen corpse lying in a basement somewhere in the city's ruins. The Soviet soldier who had defended the city room by room, building by building, survived to march west with the Red Army toward Berlin. Their fates illustrated Stalingrad's fundamental truth. The side willing to pay the higher price and capable of sustaining that payment would prevail. That truth, demonstrated across 5 months of combat that destroyed an entire German field army and killed over 500,000 Soviet defenders, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The war would continue for 28 more months. Millions more would die. The outcome would require enormous sacrifice and suffering. But the strategic trajectory established at Stalingrad, Soviet advance, German retreat, inevitable Allied victory, never changed. The mathematics had been calculated in the ruins of the city bearing Stalin's name. Everything that followed was arithmetic.